It has been just over 10 years since Jonathan Bowden's untimely death, and I wanted to create something to commemorate him. I believe that Bowden was the most charismatic and colourful character of what is often called the New Right. He had a wide range of beliefs, some of which appeared contradictory. He was, for instance, extremely critical of modern art, and yet he himself produced modern art. He would rail against the drab utilitarian nature of modernity in one sentence, only to celebrate its speed, dynamism, and energy in the next. He considered himself both a conservative and a revolutionary. These disparate ideas were unified by one belief, namely, a belief in human inequality. In his lectures, he provided an unabashed defense of inequality.
No, because I've always believed in human inequality. I believe human inequality is the basis of life, but also the basis of morality, because I believe inequality is a moral force. The real division between the left and right is not about people who support socialised medicine or even much more sort of harsh measures, if you like, and divisive measures like even ethnicity or abortion or whatever. The real division, philosophically, is those who believe that equality, enforced or otherwise, is a moral good, broadly the general left, and those who believe, and are often too frightened to say so, that inequality is a moral good, which is what the philosophical right really believes in. Even the most moderate centre-right figure, the John Majors of this world, talk about freedom, opportunity. You have opportunity, you'll have inequality, even in a market system. So, although they're frightened to mention the I word, if you like, all rightist movements, from the most moderate to the most radical, right across the spectrum, believe that inequality is inescapable, is a fact, has to be lived through, has to be dealt with, and is actually the way things should be. So, the idea that you can engineer society through radical shifts or change so as to create more equality, to me, is completely counter-propositional.
Bowden was unashamedly elitist. He sought to make the world more, rather than less, unequal. Unlike Ayn Rand and other right-wing thinkers, he did not defend an economic elite. Instead, he defended a cultural elite. He believed that cultural elites of great genius, such as Shakespeare, gave people's lives meaning. In his lecture on Shakespeare, Bowden observed,
"Why are people proud that Shakespeare's an Englishman? They're proud that he's an Englishman, whether they've opened any of his plays whatsoever at school when they were forced to do them and so on, because he's felt to embody a national consciousness, and he's felt to speak for many who didn't speak and who couldn't speak. And people are proud that they have somebody like him in their national trajectory, whether they're interested in his work or not." Self-pride is very emblematic of an ethnic sense of purpose and also a joie de vivre in relation to this life. If you strip that out and take it away from people, they lose something. They lose spirit. They become morbid and depressed. Everyone needs great cultural icons, whether they're interested in them or not. They are part of the fabric that gives an individual life some sort of meaning. Increasingly, many individuals in this society do not have an overall or an individual meaning. That's why they live moment to moment and day to day in relation to contingency and consumption. The point of great civilization, as expressed in great art, is to raise people out of that particular trough and get them, if only momentarily, looking upwards towards the sky, looking upwards towards higher forms, looking upwards towards the prospect of archetypal forms, looking upwards towards the religions of the past, the present and the future, looking upwards towards God or the gods, or the idea that they might be there, or the idea that it might be necessary that they're there, even if you don't think that they are. That's the point of great civilization. That's the point of great work. That's the point of great art.
Bowden believed that great culture and egalitarianism were incompatible. Throughout his lectures, he argued that egalitarianism was a corrosive force that stifled high culture and brought about a uniform blandness. He believed that a society committed to socially engineering equality would be incapable of producing high culture or great art. This point is perhaps best demonstrated by Pol Pot's communist regime in Cambodia.
Under communism, Pol Pot shot everyone who'd read a book that he didn't approve of. Why do you do that? Because he wanted everyone to be the same and everyone to think in the same way. Asiatics have a form of description. It's called the tall poppy syndrome. They look at the plants, they decide one's a bit out of kilter, it's standing higher than the others, So you snip it down so all are the same. He put into practice, in a cardinal way, what many of these Western idiots in the 60s with their fist in the air had been proposing. He sat in Paris, in salons, listening to Christophe, listening to Sartre, listening to de Beauvoir, and he imposed it implacably like the cretin he was. The family's immoral. Shoot all the Buddhist priests that have got people married. Shoot people who are a bit too keen on marriage. Shoot everyone who's read books about marriage. Shoot everybody who's ever said marriage is a good thing. That's quite a pile of bodies and you haven't started yet. That is communism in its rawest and its crudest form.
Pol Pot created a world much like the one described in Kurt Vonnegut's dystopian short story, Harrison Bergeron, in which all people are fully equal and not allowed to be smarter, better looking, or more physically able than anyone else. Such a world is clearly incompatible with high culture, great art, and human excellence. Whilst contemporary Western culture is not comparable to the Khmer Rouge or the world described in Vonnegut's Harrison Bergeron, it does have a strong commitment to egalitarianism. This begs the question, is the West still capable of producing great culture, or has its commitment to egalitarianism stifled its cultural creativity? Could the Western world still create a Beethoven or Shakespeare, or is that totally impossible in our day and age?
Can great art be produced in a society such as this one? It's very debatable, given the enormous pressures of conformism and censorship. Political correctness is a form of censorship. Politically correct ideology means that a tragical truthfulness to life, which often has a religious dimension to it, or if it doesn't have a religious dimension to it, it has a higher, profound, philosophical dimension to it. Political correctness, which is based upon the idea of everyone is equal and everyone is equal in love, doesn't subsist. You click your fingers and you notice in a moment it isn't true. It isn't true of any form of human life. It isn't true of any form of human interrelationship. It's not true of one relationship between a man and a woman. Therefore, if you are trying to put everything within a paradigm of such radical, enforced linguistic egalitarianism, you will fail instantly. But you will also fail to be able to create great art, because it can't be done in such a restricted and such a stifling context.
Another way that egalitarianism stifles culture is by disprivileging the heroic. The hero is an individual who combats adversity through strength, courage, and power. He has been at the centre of high culture throughout Western history. Homer's epic poetry, Rossini's operas, Shakespeare's plays, and Donatello's sculpture all deal with the heroic. This heroic literature, opera, theatre, and sculpture is rife with what could be considered right-wing themes, such as vitalism, masculinity, power, hierarchy, and Faustian adventurism. In heroic art, the fate of the masses often rests on one individual, an individual of great power who is held to a different standard to the rest of society. For this reason, the heroic is perceived as inegalitarian and quasi-fascistic by the liberal dispensation. The heroic is, in other words, inherently reactionary. It is, therefore, disprivileged. The disprivileging of the heroic in contemporary culture is perhaps best demonstrated by urban planning. If you walk through any European city, you will see heroic statues of explorers and military figures. These statues were erected before the 1950s and have not really been erected since. This is perhaps best demonstrated by the empty plinth in Trafalgar Square. The plinth was originally intended to hold an equestrian statue of William IV, who was nicknamed the Sailor King, but remained bare due to insufficient funds. For the past 150 years, the fate of the plinth has been debated. Instead of erecting a permanent statue, the plinth has been occupied by a succession of temporary works, such as Mark Quinn's torso bust of Alison Lapper, an artist who was born with no arms and shortened legs due to a birth defect.
This society cannot decide what to do with the empty plinth in Trafalgar Square, because you can't have a hero, you can't have a military figure in this post-modernity on that plinth. Why? Because it's considered to be conceptually fascistic, that's why. And that's why they have pregnant thalidomide victims instead.
The heroic has not, however, completely disappeared in contemporary Western culture. Whilst it is no longer a central theme of Western high culture, it is at the centre of popular culture. The heroic continues to be dealt with in superhero films and comic books. Bowden discussed this fact in his lecture, Leon Degrelle and the Real Tintin.
Something that has always interested me, the title of the talk is Leon Degrelle, the Real Tintin, but what I really want to talk about is the heroic in mass and in popular culture. It's interesting to note that heroic ideas and ideals have been disprivileged by pacifism, by liberalism tending to the left, and by feminism, particularly since the social and cultural revolutions of the 1960s. And yet the heroic, as an imprimatur in Western society, has gone down into the depths, into mass popular culture, often into trashy forms of culture, where the critical insight of various intellectuals doesn't particularly gaze upon it. Now, the idea of the masculine and the heroic and the Homeric in modern guise sounds absurd when it's put in tights and appears in a superhero comic and that sort of thing. But the interesting thing is because these forms of culture are so quote-unquote low, they're off the radar of that which is acceptable, and therefore certain values can come back.
Because these forms of culture are considered childish, they are not subject to the same level of political control. Directors of superhero films and writers of comic books are, therefore, free to explore right-wing themes. This is perhaps best demonstrated by Christopher Nolan's Batman trilogy, which deals, at least implicitly, with the philosophy of Oswald Spengler. I recently discussed this idea with John David Ebert. Spengler has this idea of this cyclical view of history, or a seasonal view, I guess you could call it. Could you just tell us a little bit about that?
So it is cyclical in the sense that there are these 9 civilizations. He only has 9 of them that each has the same morphological life cycle, just like a living organism does. You think of a human being, the child, and the child has certain characteristics. The teenager has certain characteristics. The mature man and the old man. There's a morphological life cycle there that's the same for everyone. Everyone has to go through these basic biomorphological stages. They're preset in the genes, so they're predetermined. So likewise with his idea of these civilizations as superorganisms, they have predetermined life cycles of about 1,000 years, ideally 1,000 years of productivity, let's say. So it moves through 4 stages. The pre-cultural stage takes a while to get going, and then it has the early culture stage and the late culture stage, and then finally the civilization phase. So they all end, and those follow the 4 seasons. And by the time you get down to the winter stage, the civilization has it's become extensive geographically rather than metaphysically, spiritually intensive. Now it's extensive. You have the concept of the megalopolis, the megalopolitan, the world city. The world is a city, and it's seen as a city. And city think in the winter stage brings along with it atheism as a matter of course, because the intellect has been uprooted from the cosmic rhythms of the land, all the seasons, let's say, that the farmer is still very much in touch with. No, there's no such thing as an atheist who's a peasant or a rural person. They're automatically religious because they're still embedded within the cosmic cycles. But city think and city intellect sort of shields. It's like a wall that's built around the intellect that staves off the cosmic forces, and you assume a materialistic worldview, which is very decadent and degenerate, basically, because it's factually incorrect, as a matter of fact.
I actually want to speak to you about Spenglerian themes in Nolan's Batman trilogy. There is obviously a group within those films called the League of Shadows. I'm just going to read you a quote. I mean, this sounds very Spenglerian to me. I don't know what you make of it, but anyway, it says, "This is not how man was supposed to live.
The League of Shadows has been a check against human corruption for thousands of years. We sacked Rome, loaded trade ships with plague rats, burnt London to the ground. Every time a civilization reaches the pinnacle of its decadence, we return to restore the balance." Yeah, I call them Spenglerian shock troops. It seems like they come in and they recognize that the institutions have become corrupt. Like you said, the ideals no longer really stand. The society is decadent, which is a word used again and again throughout those films. And basically, the League of Shadows believes that the only way the society can be redeemed is through an act of destruction.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is very Spenglerian. The League of Shadows, with that speech, I seem to remember that was Liam Neeson pronouncing that speech in that first Christopher Nolan Batman film. And that is exactly what's going on there, whether Nolan is consciously aware of what he's doing or not. He may be just naively using the imagination to dramatize cool stuff. But other forces are always involved. When the imagination starts to imagine scenarios, there are forces, structures in the psyche, in the unconscious, in the collective unconscious that shape those structures so that they come out in a way that makes sense.
Yes.
Whether the artist is aware of these echoes or not, it doesn't matter. Gotham is definitely a late stage civilization in its winter phase where the city has completely taken over.
The League follows Spengler's teaching that history moves in cycles, beginning with a golden age and declining into a dark age, which then collapses and gives place to a new golden age. The mission of the League of Shadows is to appear when a civilization has reached the peak of its decadence and then give it a push. They have done this throughout history. The villains in Batman are never motivated by petty material desires. They are always motivated by justice. They believe that Gotham can only be brought to justice through a cleansing fire. Gotham must be destroyed in order to be saved. The late stage of civilization must end in order to give way to something new. In The Decline and Fall of the West, Spengler argues that late-stage civilization often gives rise to a Caesar figure. The theme of Caesarism is dealt with explicitly in The Dark Knight. Harvey Dent likens Batman to a Roman dictator who assumes executive power in a time of emergency.
I'm talking about the kind of city that idolizes a masked vigilante.
Gotham City is proud of an ordinary citizen standing up for what's right.
Gotham needs heroes like you, elected officials, not a man who thinks he is above the law.
Exactly. Who appointed the Batman?
We did. All of us who stood by and let scum take control of our city.
But this is a democracy, Harvey.
When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. And it wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service.
Harvey, the last man that they appointed to protect the Republic was named Caesar, and he never gave up his power.
Batman is Caesar-like, insofar as he assumes extrajudicial powers and operates outside of the law. He has not, however, completely lost faith in the city or democracy. Bruce sees his own fight against organised crime as provisional and hopes to be able to create the conditions whereby a public official of a democratic government can take up the struggle through more legitimate means. That is why he places so much faith in Harvey Dent. Batman believes Gotham should be saved, no matter how decadent and corrupt its institutions have become. This, according to Bowden, is typical of the modern hero. Heroes that appear in modern films are masculine, violent, and authoritarian. They operate outside of the law and are fundamentally at odds with liberal values. And yet, they always end up defending liberalism against authoritarian figures.
One of the great tricks of the heroic in the last 40 to 50 years is that heroic films, involving icons like Clint Eastwood, for example, as a successor to the sort of archetype of John Wayne and the sort of Western stylized masculinity that he represented, Eastwood often plays individualistic, survivalist and authoritarian figures, right-wing existentialist figures. But they're always at war with bureaucracies and values that are perceived as conservative. One of the basic tricks which has occurred since the 1960s is to reorient the nature of the heroic so that the internal radical right within a society, such as the United States or elsewhere, is the enemy.
The modern hero is, in other words, a paradoxical character. He is fundamentally at odds with liberal values, and yet he always fights to defend them. He often has more in common with the villains that he clashes with than the people he defends. He shares his enemies' capacity for violence and hatred of corruption, but he doesn't share their political aims. He remains committed to liberal institutions, whilst the villain seeks to destroy them. At the end of each film, Batman triumphs over the villain who has sought to destroy Gotham. He defends Gotham against authoritarian encroachments, but his victories are often pyrrhic. The enemy is defeated, but Gotham is even more corrupt and crime-ridden than before. This is perhaps best demonstrated in the most recent Batman film, which has a confusing and contradictory ending. Batman has defeated his enemy, and yet Gotham is in a worse state. This seems to validate what his enemies claim, namely that the city is beyond saving, that only a cleansing fire can redeem it. In contemporary Western culture, the heroic has been disprivileged. Men who were once worshipped as heroes are increasingly viewed as villains. This has a profound impact on the way we view ourselves, because we are in large part defined by our heroes. The Founding Fathers defined what it meant to be an American in the same way that Moses defined what it meant to be Jewish. A people are, in other words, a reflection of their heroes. When they come to see their heroes as villains, they come to view themselves as evil. This explains why so many Westerners have come to loathe themselves. It also explains the Western world's childish obsession with superhero movies. Because the heroes of the past are increasingly disprivileged, we must turn to the heroes of fantasy and fiction. This is, on one hand, contemptible. On the other, it suggests that people are still capable of hero worship, despite what they've been taught about equality and masculinity. It suggests that our culture still has space for the heroic, even if it is constrained and confined in numerous ways. If this hero worship could be channeled towards actual historical figures, rather than figures of fantasy and fiction, our entire way of looking at ourselves would change. We can, in other words, shape our future and sense of self by changing our relationship with the heroic figures of the past. Bowden understood this and sought to promote a new relationship to the past and the heroic. So, I give you the great British orator and artist, Jonathan Bowden.
And I personally think that if you inculcate yourself with a bit of irony and estrangement from some of the elements of the culture of the heroic that certainly subsisted as mainstream cultural fare in our society before 1950, you have a different attitude towards what spews out of the telly every evening. And you have a different attitude towards the sort of culture that you're living in. And you have a different attitude towards great figures in your own group and even in others. And you have a different attitude towards yourself and the future.